Tonight, he walked into the meeting room of America's most notorious men on the East Coast, not alone. Beside Lucien Moretti, heir to a multi-billion-dollar crime empire, was a maid in a black and white uniform, head bowed, eyes fixed on the floor. The room erupted in scornful laughter. They laughed at him, they laughed at her, but none of them knew that the woman holding Lucien's coat tonight had spent 7 years silently memorizing every face, every heist, every drop of blood they tried to bury. And tonight, she would turn it all upside down. Like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has come. Follow to the end. You won't guess what comes next. The rain had been falling since noon, but by 9 o'clock it stopped pretending to be gentle. It came down in sheets now, hammering the slate roof of Bellacourt Estate with the kind of persistence that felt personal, like weather with a grudge. The Atlantic was somewhere below the cliffs, invisible in the dark, but you could hear it, low and constant, a sound that had no interest in being beautiful. Lucien Moretti arrived late. That alone was enough to make people nervous. In the 12 years since he'd taken control of the Moretti syndicate from his father's cooling hands, Lucien had never once been late to anything. Not a funeral, not a wire transfer, not a single meeting in which men's lives were quietly decided over port wine and eye contact. His punctuality was one of the few things his enemies respected, because it told them something true about him, that he considered every room worth preparing for, that he did not walk into places without already knowing how he intended to leave them. So when the double doors of the Bellacourt ballroom opened at 9:14 instead of 9 sharp, every head in the room turned, and when they saw who was standing beside him, the nervous energy curdled into something else entirely. She was unremarkable, at first glance. A woman in a maid's uniform, black dress, white cuffs, white collar, dark hair pulled back and pinned flat. She stood with her shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone trained to disappear, holding Lucien's overcoat folded over both forearms the way staff are taught to do. Her eyes were pointed at the marble floor. She didn't look at anyone. The room processed this for about 3 seconds. Then, slowly, the laughter started. It didn't begin as laughter exactly. It was more like a collective exhale, a shared, disbelieving breath that moved around the room like a current. Carmine Falsetti, who controlled half the New Jersey waterfront and had survived 2 assassination attempts, brought his glass to his lips and smiled over the rim without drinking. The Verone brothers, still technically rivals from the Boston corridor, exchanged a look across the room and found for the first time in years that they agreed on something. Even the women, the wives and the daughters and the 2 female consiglieres present, stopped their own private conversations to stare. The maid didn't look up. Lucien didn't acknowledge any of it. He crossed the ballroom floor with the same contained stride he always carried, the one that seemed perpetually unhurried, and that perpetual unhurriedness was itself a form of aggression. He stopped near the long table at the room's center and gestured for one of his own men to take his coat from Elena's arms, which the man did. And then Elena stepped back exactly 1 pace and folded her hands in front of her waist and resumed staring at nothing in particular. Vittorio Moretti was the one who spoke first. He was 61 years old, Lucien's father's younger brother, a man who had outlived 3 separate attempts on his life and attributed his survival not to luck, but to a quality he called patience, though the people who knew him best called it something colder. He was standing near the fireplace at the far end of the room with 2 of his men behind him, and when he opened his mouth, his voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had decided the evening's conclusion before it began. "You bring domestic staff to a war council now?" The laughter that followed was broader this time. More people willing to join it. Lucien poured himself a glass of water from the table. He drank about half of it. He set the glass down and turned to survey the room with the unhurried patience of a man reading a menu. "I bring," he said, "whoever I decide to bring." "A maid, Lucien." Vittorio gestured vaguely in Elena's direction without looking at her. "What is this? A joke? A test? Or have you simply lost your sense of occasion?" "I know exactly what occasion this is." Vittorio smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already won and was enjoying the formality of pretending otherwise. "Then perhaps she can serve the wine while we discuss the future of the Atlantic routes. She's dressed for it, at least." The room laughed again, and this time there was less restraint in it. People who'd been holding back now deciding that Vittorio had established the tone, and they were all permitted to join it. Elena's expression didn't change. She stood the way she always stood at these functions. Still, patient, marginally present, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Lucian looked at her briefly, and in that brief look there was something that the room was too busy laughing to notice. Calculation. Not affection, not embarrassment. The focused attention of a man watching a board for the precise moment to move. He turned back to the table and said nothing else. The meeting was supposed to begin at 9, and it began at 9:20, and the 20 minutes of delay had accomplished something subtle. It had given every person in that room time to underestimate him. He understood this. He had counted on it. The gathering had been convened for one purpose. Rafael Suarez, the Venezuelan-born boss who'd controlled the Atlantic shipping corridor from the Chesapeake to Nova Scotia for 11 years, had been dead for 6 days. He'd been found in his car outside his house in Maryland, shot once through the driver's side window, with a precision that everyone in the room understood was professional, and everyone in the room was pretending not to know the origin of. The shipping routes Suarez had controlled were now effectively ungoverned territory, and ungoverned territory, in the world these men inhabited, lasted approximately as long as it took for the nearest ambitious party to claim it. Every family present believed they had the strongest claim. Lucien believed the same. The difference was that Lucien had brought a maid. The meeting opened with formalities that no one respected. A brief acknowledgement of Suarez's death that was more performance than grief, followed by a recitation of each family's existing stake in the Atlantic corridor. Carmine Falchetti spoke first, then the Verones, then a heavy-set man named Dobrescu, who represented a Romanian faction out of Philadelphia that had quietly accumulated significant port influence over the past 3 years. Each man spoke with the same careful modulation, making claims that were really threats rendered in the grammar of polite conversation. Lucien listened. Elena stood near the south wall with 2 other staff members, a pair of genuine Bellacourt employees who ignored her completely because she had been present at functions like this often enough that her presence registered as routine. She held a silver tray on which sat 3 untouched glasses of water. No one asked her for anything. No one looked at her. She was perfectly, professionally invisible. And she was listening too. She always listened. 7 years is a long time to be invisible. 7 years of carrying trays and pressing uniforms and walking quietly through rooms where men said things they would never say in front of people they considered important. 7 years of learning what the word overlooked actually meant. Not just professionally, not just in this estate, but as a structural reality. The ways that powerful men stopped perceiving anything below a certain status threshold. The way she had learned to make herself fall below that threshold deliberately. To become background. To become part of the architecture. She had cultivated this skill the way other people cultivated languages. Systematically, with patience, understanding that fluency came not from talent, but from repetition and time. Elena Vale, which was not her name, but which had been her name for 7 years, with documentation clean enough to survive the kind of scrutiny these people applied to their staff, had learned to be fluent in invisibility. She was also fluent in Sicilian, in financial law, in the specific argot of 6 different criminal organizations, and in the maritime protocols governing every major shipping corridor on the eastern seaboard. None of this was visible from across a ballroom. That was, of course, entirely the point. The meeting deteriorated over the next 40 minutes in the way that these meetings always deteriorated. Gradually, then all at once. The polite language eroded into something more direct as the wine disappeared and the financial stakes became clear. Voices rose incrementally. Accusations were made in the form of observations. Threats were made in the form of historical references. Dobrescu suggested that Lucien's claim to the Northern Corridor was overstated, given the Moretti Syndicate's recent distractions, a word he said while looking directly at Elena, and Carmine Falchetti agreed with him in a way that was deniable but unmistakable. They were circling him. The Verone brothers, who had legitimate grievances against Lucien from a decade-old port dispute that had cost them 2 warehouses and a customs contact, came at him from a different angle. They questioned whether the Moretti Syndicate had the operational capacity to govern routes of this scale, given what they called internal structural questions, which was a careful way of referencing the rumors which had been circulating for months, that Lucien's grip on his own organization was weakening, that certain captains were looking toward other leadership, that the Moretti Empire was perhaps more hollow than its exterior suggested. Lucien absorbed all of this without visible reaction. Vittorio, from his position near the fireplace, watched his nephew the way a man watches something he's already decided to discard. It had been Vittorio who called the meeting. Technically, it had been framed as a collective initiative, a council of concerned parties responding to the Suarez vacuum. But everyone in the room understood that the Bellicourt estate was Moretti property, that the invitations had originated from Vittorio's network rather than Lucien's, and that the gathering carried Vittorio's specific fingerprints in ways that the more observant guests had noticed and chosen to say nothing about. Lucien had noticed too. He'd noticed 3 months ago when the first of Vittorio's private communiques to Carmine Falcetti had been intercepted by a contact Lucien had placed inside Falcetti's organization 2 years earlier. He'd noticed the shape of the thing taking form, the quiet outreach, the gradual repositioning, the careful cultivation of grievances among people who had reason to distrust Lucien already. The architecture of a coup assembled patiently, the way Vittorio assembled everything. He had said nothing. He had waited. Because Lucien Moretti's singular professional skill, the quality that had allowed him to consolidate the syndicate at 26, to double its reach by 30, to navigate 5 separate federal investigations without a single conviction, was not intimidation. It was not violence. It was not even intelligence, though he had plenty of that. It was timing. He knew, with the specific instinct of someone who had spent his adult life in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment meant the end of everything, exactly when to move and exactly when to wait. And he had learned more recently, and at significant personal cost, that the best traps were the ones that felt like victories to the people stepping into them. The meeting had been going for 50 minutes when Vittorio made his move. It came disguised as a procedural suggestion. He recommended that the council vote immediately on the redistribution of the Atlantic routes, using a framework he had prepared in advance, which he presented as a helpful initiative because, of course, he presented it as a helpful initiative, and which, upon close reading, allocated the primary northern and mid-Atlantic corridors to a consortium controlled primarily by Falcetti and Dobrescu, with the Veronis receiving compensatory southern access, and the Moretti syndicate receiving what amounted to a ceremonial administrative role with no real territory and no real income. It was elegant. It was prepared. It had clearly been agreed upon in advance by the relevant parties, because the speed with which Falcetti and Dobrescu expressed enthusiastic support, the specific rhythm of it, the absence of deliberation, told a story that only worked if they'd rehearsed it. The room waited to see what Lucien would do. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving slowly around the room and said nothing for a long moment. And in that long moment, the atmosphere underwent a particular shift. People became aware that something was coming, though they couldn't have said what. Then he looked toward the south wall. "Elena," he said. She set the tray down on a side table and walked toward the center of the room with a stride that was nothing like the walk of a woman who'd spent the evening being invisible. It was unhurried, but it was not humble. She moved through the middle of the gathering, through the cluster of men who were too surprised to move aside quickly enough, and she arrived at the foot of the main staircase that curved up from the ballroom to the estate's upper gallery. She paused there. "Show them," Lucien said. The laughter started again, lower this time, edged with something unfamiliar. Men who had been comfortable with the evening's narrative, the distracted heir, the embarrassing companion, felt that comfort becomes slightly unstable. Elena began to climb the stairs. She climbed them slowly, and somewhere between the 3rd and 6th step, the quality of the room's attention changed. It was difficult to articulate exactly what shifted, because nothing visible had changed. She was still wearing the same uniform. Her hair was still pinned back the same way. She hadn't produced a weapon or raised her voice. But the angle of her shoulders had altered. The downward angle of her gaze, pointed at steps rather than floors, was different from the downward angle of someone avoiding eye contact. She reached the landing and turned, and for the first time that evening, she looked directly at the room. The faces below her were lit by chandelier light and firelight, and she took them in with the patient thoroughness of someone cross-referencing a mental list. Then she reached up and removed the white cuffs from her wrists, one at a time. The gesture was precise, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of gesture that carries weight when it happens slowly enough for the people watching it to understand that it is intended to carry weight. The elder bosses in the room recognized what they were seeing before anyone else did. Dubrescu, who was Romanian and 43 and had not grown up inside Sicilian tradition, missed it entirely. The Verone brothers were young enough to be uncertain, but Carmine Falcetti, who was 68 and whose grandmother had come from Palermo, went very still. Vittorio's expression, for the first time all evening, became difficult to read. Elena's voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and unhurried and addressed the room in Sicilian Italian, so old and precise and regionally specific that several of the older men reflexively straightened their spines. "My father taught me," she said, "that weak men insult servants because they're afraid of queens." The room did not laugh. No one spoke. Elena's eyes moved across the gathered faces with a specific quality of attention, the kind that communicates, without stating it, that she has seen all of them before, that she has been watching them, precisely and carefully, for longer than they are comfortable with. She began to speak. What came out of her mouth over the next several minutes was a systematic dismantling of every person present, not through insult, not through accusation without evidence, but through the calm, methodical recitation of specific, accurate, verifiable information that no outsider, no civilian, no hired intelligence, no federal informant should have possessed. She named port accounts. The specific account numbers of 3 offshore structures connected to Falcetti's operation that had been established in 2019 through a shell company whose paper trail ended in Liechtenstein. She named the customs official in Baltimore who had been receiving monthly payments from the Verone brothers for 6 years, and the specific dollar amounts of the last 4 transfers and the routing code of the account those payments landed in. She named the senator, the specific senator, by name, by state, by the exact nature of the arrangement, and by the occasion, a fundraiser in Newport in the spring of 3 years ago, at which the arrangement had been formalized, and the 2 other people present who could confirm it if they were still alive, and why one of them wasn't. Men who had been sitting slightly forward in their chairs sat back. Men who had been smiling stopped smiling. The air in the room changed the way the air changes before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the atmospheric pressure shift that announces it. She named the war in Naples, the trade dispute 3 years earlier that had cost 6 lives across 2 families, which everyone present had accepted as the organic result of territorial friction. She named the captain from within this room who had provided location intelligence to one side while collecting payment from the other. She named the meeting at which this was arranged, the restaurant, the city, the date, and what was ordered for dinner. The captain in question was in the room right now, and his face, under the chandelier light, was the color of old wax. Elena paused. She reached up and unpinned her hair, and it fell around her shoulders, and she stood on the landing above them all without any of the gestures she had used all evening to make herself smaller. "My name," she said, "is Elena De Luca." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the silence that followed it was the particular silence of people absorbing something that reorganizes everything they thought they understood. Vittorio's wine glass cracked in his hand, not because he broke it deliberately, because his grip involuntarily became too much. "Matteo De Luca's daughter," Elena said. "For those of you doing the mathematics right now, yes, I've been working in this estate for 7 years, and yes, I have been present at a significant number of your private conversations, and yes, I remember all of them." The room broke into noise, and the noise broke into movement, and the movement was the specific kind that happens when frightened, dangerous men stop performing and start reacting. Vittorio's voice cut through all of it. "She's De Luca blood!" His composure, which had been extraordinary for a man whose coup was dissolving in real time, fractured around the edges. "You brought a viper into this family, into this house. She's been, for 7 years, she has been listening," Lucian said. He hadn't moved from his seat. His voice was very quiet, which made it carry. "Yes, that's what she's been doing. I know." Vittorio stared at him. "You know. I've known for 3 months. The temperature of the room dropped by several degrees. The recalculation happening across every face in the gathering was visible. The scrambling reassessment of every conversation, every disclosure, every moment of assumed privacy in this estate over the past 3 months, through the lens of a man who knew he was being watched and said nothing, who knew what was coming and let it come. "You brought her here tonight," Vittorio said, and his voice was no longer performing patience. It was something rawer than that. "You knew what she was going to say, and you—" "I brought her here," Lucien said, "because she is the only honest person in this room." For a half-second, nothing happened. Then, several things happened simultaneously. Lucien's men, stationed throughout the room in positions that had appeared to be random, but were not, moved to cover the exits. Not aggressively. They simply existed at every door in a way that made the doors inaccessible. Vittorio's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. A man near the fireplace moved at the same moment, and Elena De Luca, from the landing of the staircase, watched Vittorio's hand with the focused, still attention of someone who had known, for 7 years, that this moment was coming, and who had prepared for every version of it, and who was only now allowing herself to wonder whether the version currently unfolding was the one she had prepared for. The question was answered when Vittorio's gun cleared his jacket, and the first shot, when it came, did not come from Vittorio. It came from the man near the fireplace, and it did not go toward Lucien. It went toward the chandelier above the center of the room. Crystal exploded downward in a shower of light and glass, and in the fractured second of confusion that followed, Bellecourt Estate stopped being a war council and became something else entirely. Elena gripped the banister with both hands as the room below her descended into chaos, and she thought, with the cold clarity that her father had trained into her from the age of 9, that there were 2 things she had not accounted for in any of her 7 years of preparation: the mercenaries Vittorio had placed among the guests, and the way her hands were shaking, not from fear, from something she didn't have a word for yet, something that had started 3 months ago in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with a man who already knew who she was and poured her coffee anyway, and said, without looking at her, "You don't have to do this the way you planned." She had told him she didn't know what he meant. She had been lying. The room below her was screaming, and men were dying, and the empire that had killed her father was tearing itself apart around the man she had come here to destroy. And Elena De Luca gripped the banister and made a choice that 7 years ago she would not have been capable of making. She moved toward the stairs. She moved toward him, and the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and 6 men she had never seen before walked through them with weapons already drawn. And whatever she had expected this night to become, it was not this. The 6 men came through the doors the way professionals come through doors, not running, not shouting, not performing anything. They walked. That was the thing that registered first, not the weapons, which were visible and real, but the walk. The specific, unhurried quality of men who had done this before and understood that speed was less useful than positioning, and that the most dangerous thing in any room was not the loudest thing, but the calmest. Elena counted them from the landing in the time it took the room below to fully understand what was happening. 6. Spread in a fan pattern that covered the 3 main sight lines from the entrance, semi-automatic weapons suppressed. Dressed as catering staff, the same dark uniforms that Bellecourt's genuine catering staff wore, a detail that would have required someone with access to the estate's internal arrangements to coordinate, someone who'd been inside the estate's logistics for longer than 1 evening. She moved down the stairs, not because she had a plan, because Lucien was on the ground floor, and the ground floor was where everything was happening, and there was no version of this night in which she stayed on the landing and watched. Below her, the room had cracked along its fault lines with the sudden violence of something that had been under pressure for too long. Lucien's men at the doors were responding to the newcomers, which meant the exits were no longer being covered the way they'd been 30 seconds ago. 2 of the bosses had upended the banquet table and were behind it. Falchetti was on the floor, and she couldn't tell from this angle whether he'd chosen to be or been made to be. The Verone brothers had separated, one moving toward the east wall, one toward the fireplace. And the specific direction each of them had moved suggested they were not panicking randomly. They were moving toward prearranged positions, which meant the Verones had known. She reached the bottom of the stairs and a hand closed around her arm. She almost broke it before she registered who it belonged to. Lucien's grip was hard enough to leave marks. He pulled her toward the interior wall without saying anything. His body turned so that his back was to the room's main sight lines, and he pressed her into the narrow space between a heavy sideboard and the wall. He was breathing through his nose, controlled, but she could feel the tension in his forearm. Not fear exactly, but the muscular readiness of someone whose body had already made decisions that his mind was still processing. "The catering uniforms," she said quietly. "I saw. Someone from inside gave them access." "I know." "It wasn't recent. That kind of coordination takes—" "Elena." His voice was very flat. "I know." She looked at him. The chandelier was gone, and what remained was firelight and the emergency panel lighting that had kicked on near the floor. And in that light, his face was all sharp angles and shadow. He was watching the room over her shoulder with the unfocused focus of someone monitoring peripheral movement, and his jaw was set in a way she recognized. Not anger, something colder than anger. "How long have you known," she asked, "about the mercenaries?" "Since this afternoon." "And you didn't— If I'd changed the plan this afternoon, we'd have lost the evidence. The timing, the room, the witnesses." His eyes came back to her face briefly. "I needed them to move first." She stared at him. "You let them bring armed men into a room you were standing in." "Yes." "To preserve the sequence." "Yes." She thought about several things she could say to that and chose none of them, because across the room one of the 6 men in catering uniforms raised his weapon toward the cluster of people behind the upended table, and she was already moving before she'd consciously decided to. She came around the end of the sideboard low and fast, which was not a choice her body made by consulting her mind. It was a reflex built across years of training in a compound outside Palermo, where her father had insisted that both his daughters understood that the world would not accommodate their softness, and that they should therefore not develop any. She crossed the 12 feet of open floor between the sideboard and the man before he'd finished adjusting his aim, and the specific mechanics of what she did next were not elegant, but they were effective. And 30 seconds later, the man was on the floor, and she was standing with his weapon, and her heartbeat was somewhere around 140, and her hands had stopped shaking. The room was loud and dark, and smelled like gunpowder and broken glass. Lucien appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at Elena. "Your father," he said, "trained you the same way he trained sons. He only had daughters." She checked the weapon's magazine with the automatic economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "He adapted." Something moved across Lucien's face that she didn't have time to read. They moved together toward the center of the room, falling into a proximity that wasn't planned but felt, to both of them, like the most natural spatial arrangement available. A recognition, operating below the level of conscious decision, that they were each other's best immediate asset in this specific situation. The firefight, such as it was, lasted another 4 minutes. Lucien's men, though caught partly off position, were better armed than the mercenaries had anticipated, and the mercenaries' primary advantage, surprise, had been partially negated by the fact that Lucien had apparently anticipated something. 2 of the 6 were down. The others had retreated toward the estate's east corridor, which Elena knew from 7 years of walking it, that it led to the service wing, and from there to the kitchen, and from there to the rear delivery entrance, which opened onto the cliff path. She told Lucien. He sent 3 men after them. Then the room settled into the specific horrible quiet that follows acute violence. Not silence, because there were sounds everywhere, people and pain and the distant crash of the Atlantic below the cliffs, but the absence of the immediate urgent noise. The noise that demands action. What replaced it was the noise that demands assessment. Vittorio was still alive. That was the first thing Elena confirmed, and the process of confirming it produced in her a complex reaction she didn't examine too carefully. He was on the far side of the overturned table, standing now, his jacket torn at the shoulder where someone had pulled him down fast. 2 of his own men flanked him, both armed, both watching the room with the alert stillness of men waiting for an order. He was looking at Lucien. The look carried across the destroyed ballroom something that Elena had not seen on Vittorio Moretti's face in any of the 7 years she'd watched him. It was not rage, not calculation, not the performed patience that was his most consistent affect. It was something closer to recognition. The particular expression of a man who has been engaged in a long game and has just seen, for the first time, the full shape of the game his opponent has been playing. Falchetti was alive. He'd been knocked down by one of Lucien's men when the shooting started and had the sense to stay down. The Verone brothers were both visible, both unhurt, both standing near the east wall with the careful neutrality of men deciding which side of a line to stand on. Dobrescu was gone. The empty space where he'd been standing registered late, and when it registered, Lucien's attention sharpened. "Where's the Romanian?" he said to no one in particular. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The Romanian's absence, in the specific context of this specific evening, communicated everything that an answer would have. "He knew," Elena said. "He's been Vittorio's contact in Philadelphia for 8 months. I didn't know that until 6 weeks ago." "You didn't tell me." "No." She looked at him. "What else didn't you tell me?" He held her gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. "We should finish this conversation somewhere without witnesses. We should finish this conversation right now." "Elena." "What else?" The room was listening. Falchetti was listening. The Verones were listening. Vittorio was listening with an attention so concentrated it was almost physical. And Lucien stood in the middle of the ruined ballroom of his family's estate and breathed and made the calculation visible in his face to anyone who knew how to read him of how much truth the next few minutes could support. "The captain," he said finally. "Rinaldi. The one you named from the landing. He didn't just feed intelligence to the Naples conflict. He's been coordinating with Vittorio for 3 years, and his primary assignment for the last 14 months has been building a case that I'm unfit to lead. Testimony, documentation, financial records designed to support a claim that I've been using syndicate resources for personal purposes." He paused. "Specifically, for hiding you." The silence this produced was dense. "So the coup," Elena said slowly, "is not just about the Atlantic routes. The Atlantic routes are the occasion. The coup was already in motion. The routes are the justification." Vittorio's voice came across the room before she could respond. "It's not a coup," he said. His tone had recovered some of its composure, which made it more dangerous rather than less. "It's a correction. The Moretti Syndicate has operated for 63 years on the understanding that personal interests do not override organizational interests, that one man's infatuation with a—" He paused, and the pause was precise and deliberate. "A situation does not compromise the security of hundreds of people who depend on this organization's stability." "You murdered her father," Lucien said. Flat, declarative, the way you state a fact about the weather. "I made a decision." "You made a decision to kill Matteo De Luca and blame the Calabrese faction and start a war that cost this organization $40 million and 11 lives because Matteo De Luca was about to expose the money you'd been pulling out of the Eastern accounts for 6 years." Lucien's voice didn't rise. If anything, it became quieter. "I've had the documentation for 3 months. The same documentation Elena spent 7 years assembling. We compared notes." Vittorio looked at Elena. It was the first time all evening that he'd looked at her directly, and the look contained something that she hadn't expected. Not guilt, because Vittorio Moretti's moral architecture didn't include the structural support for guilt, but recognition, a reassessment. He was looking at her the way you look at something you consistently underestimated and are now, too late, correctly evaluating. "Your father," he said, "was also a man who let sentiment compromise judgment." Her jaw tightened. "Don't?" He could have made the practical choice at any of 3 different moments, and he didn't, because he was, like his daughter, apparently, constitutionally incapable of separating what he felt from what he should do. "Vittorio," Lucien's voice. "She's been in your house for 7 years. 7 years of access to your accounts, your schedules, your security arrangements, your communications, and you," he gestured, a short, almost contemptuous movement. "You fell in love with her. A woman who came here to kill you." The words landed in the room with a specific kind of weight, not because they were revelatory. Most of the people present had already understood, from the sequence of the evening's disclosures, the broad shape of Elena's original purpose. But hearing it stated directly, baldly, in the open air of the room, made it concrete in a way that it hadn't been before. Elena felt Lucien go still beside her. Not with surprise, with something more controlled than surprise. She'd told him. 3 months ago, in the kitchen, at 2 in the morning. She'd told him everything. The original plan, the years of it, the specific research she'd done on his involvement in her father's death, and the specific moment, roughly 18 months into her time at Bellecourt, when the evidence had begun to contradict the conclusion she'd arrived with. She'd told him about the recalibration, the slow, unwilling revision of her understanding of who he was and what he'd known and what he was responsible for. She had told him all of it. What she hadn't told him was this. For about 6 months after the recalibration, after she'd understood that he wasn't what she'd believed him to be, she had still not been entirely sure whether she was going to kill him anyway. Not for her father's death, which she could no longer lay at his feet, but for what he was, for what this organization was, for the clean, practical logic of removing the head of a criminal empire that had caused irreparable harm to an incalculable number of people, regardless of whether that specific head was personally culpable for one specific crime. She had decided, eventually, against it. The decision had been complicated. The decision had involved a night in November, 3 years ago, when she'd watched Lucien sit across a table from a man who wanted him to approve an exploitation network operating through 3 Atlantic ports, and Lucien had listened to the whole proposal in complete silence and then stood up and broken the man's jaw and said, very quietly, "Not in any building with my name on it, and not anywhere else that I can reach," and had walked out. The decision had involved other nights, other moments, a slow accumulation of evidence that complicated the template she'd built before arriving here. She hadn't wanted it to complicate things, but her father had also trained her to follow evidence. She had not told Lucien about those 6 months. Standing in the ruined ballroom now, with Vittorio's voice still in the air, she understood that she was going to have to. "Yes," she said. The word was addressed to the room, but directed at Lucien. "I came here to kill him." She kept her voice level. Her eyes were on the middle distance. That was the original objective. 7 years ago, when I built the documentation and created the identity and applied for the position at Bellecourt, the intended conclusion was Lucien's death, as payment for my father's. The room absorbed this. I stopped believing he was responsible about a year and a half in. She finally looked at Lucien. He was watching her with an expression that was very controlled and very still, and that she was not entirely able to read. The evidence didn't support it. "I'm my father's daughter. I follow evidence." "And after?" Vittorio pressed. He knew what he was doing, driving a wedge into whatever stood between them, using her own words as the tool. "When you knew he wasn't responsible, you stayed. Why?" "Because the evidence about you was still building." "That's the reason you stayed." She met his eyes. "It's one of the reasons." The distinction hung in the air. Lucien's hand moved, not toward her, just a shift of weight, a micro-adjustment of his position that brought him approximately 2 inches closer to her. It was not a large movement, it was not a dramatic one, but in the room's current atmosphere, which was calibrated to read every gesture for information, several people noticed it. Vittorio noticed it. And his expression, for the first time, became something other than strategic. 63 years, he said, and now his voice had a different quality. Lower, tighter, the words coming from somewhere more personal than calculation. "My brother and I built this from a shipping company and a loan from men who are dead. We built it through 3 federal investigations and 2 wars and a recession that destroyed half our competition. And we built it into something that has survived long enough to make your father's ambitions look like a regional hobby." His eyes were on Lucien now, not Elena. "And you would put all of that at risk, for this." "You keep saying that," Lucien said, "like sentiment is the accusation, like caring about something makes me weak." "It does." "Then explain to me how a man who spent 6 years stealing from his own organization in order to fund a private life his brother didn't know about is making the argument that I am the one corrupted by personal interest." The room went very quiet. Vittorio's composure cracked, not visibly, not in any large dramatic way. But Elena had spent 7 years watching this man's face, and she saw it. The almost imperceptible shift of the muscles around his jaw, the slight change in the quality of his stillness from controlled to rigid. The accounts. I have the records, Vittorio. Everything Elena built, plus 14 months of our own work. The money you moved, the way you moved it, the life you built with it outside this organization's sight. Lucien's voice was still quiet. The quietness had become its own form of pressure. I don't care what you did with it. I care that you killed a man to cover it and started a war and then spent 15 years letting this organization carry the cost of that war while you continued to take from it. He paused. That's the accusation. That's what tonight is about. Not her. Vittorio pulled his weapon. He'd been holding it at his side since early in the room's chaos, visible but unthreatening in the way that an unconcealed gun can be unthreatening when everyone in a room is armed. The act of raising it changed the atmosphere in a way that was immediate and total. Both his flanking men raised their weapons simultaneously. Lucien's remaining men responded. Elena moved without deciding to move, planting herself at an angle that was not in front of Lucien. Not exactly, but that would require anyone shooting at Lucien to account for her first, and she brought up the weapon she'd taken from the mercenary, and the room held in the specific agonized suspension of a moment before irreversible action. Put her aside, Vittorio said. His voice was tight now, the composure mostly gone. Walk away from her. Stand with your family. I will give you that. I will give you the roots. I will give you the counsel. I will No. One word. Nothing else. Vittorio's face did something complicated. The grief in it, if it was grief, lasted approximately 1 second before it became something harder. Then there's nothing more to discuss tonight, he said. His phone lit up in his breast pocket. He didn't take his eyes off Lucien, but he pressed the answer key, and a voice came through the speaker, thin and electronic, and 2 words long. We're ready. And the east corridor doors opened, and Rinaldi walked through them with 20 men that Elena had never seen before, and they fanned into the room, and the math of the room changed in a way that was brutal and simple, and Lucien's expression told her that he had not accounted for this, and that told her something she hadn't known until this moment. That despite everything, despite the planning, the timing, the trap, the documentation, the 3 months of strategy, Vittorio had been running a longer game. She looked at the 20 men. She looked at Rinaldi's face, which was the face of a man who had been waiting a long time to be on the winning side of something. She looked at Lucien. How many men do you have left in this building? She asked quietly. He answered her with the stillness of someone doing arithmetic they don't like the result of. Not enough, he said. And the doors behind Rinaldi's men opened again, and the smell of smoke came through them, and Elena understood, with the cold clarity that was her father's primary inheritance, that Bellecourt estate was on fire. Not metaphorically, not as escalation or threat. The east corridor was burning, and the smoke coming through the doors was not the thin gray smoke of something small and manageable. It was thick and low, and moved with the specific heaviness of accelerant, of something that had been planned and positioned and lit at a precise moment by someone who knew the building's architecture well enough to know exactly where to start it, someone who had been inside this estate for longer than one evening. Elena's mind ran the calculation before her body had finished processing the smell. The service wing was east, the kitchen was east, the delivery entrance was east. Every exit on the eastern face of Bellecourt was now either burning or blocked by Rinaldi's 20 men, and the western face opened onto cliff and Atlantic, a 200-foot drop onto rocks that the ocean had been working on for 10,000 years without making noticeably softer. Lucien grabbed her arm. Not gently. The grip of someone operating on pure decision, no consultation. He pulled her toward the interior staircase, not the grand one she'd descended earlier, but the narrow staff staircase behind the south wall that she knew, and he apparently knew too, which meant he'd learned the building's secondary architecture at some point, which meant he'd prepared for the possibility of needing to move through it quickly, which meant he had not been entirely unprepared for this, only for the specific scale of it. 20 men was more than he'd planned for. The fire was more than he'd planned for. Rinaldi was the thing he hadn't planned for at all, and Elena understood now, in the fractured seconds of their movement across the room, that this was the specific gap. Rinaldi she had named from the landing, Rinaldi she had exposed as the captain who'd fed intelligence to the Naples conflict. And Rinaldi had been in this room when she'd done it, and Lucien had apparently calculated that exposure as a neutralizing move. A man publicly identified as a traitor loses his operational value, loses his credibility, loses his leverage. What Lucien had not calculated was that Rinaldi had nothing left to lose. That a man with nothing left to lose, backed by Vittorio's resources and 20 armed bodies in a building he'd already committed to burning, was not neutralized. He was liberated. They reached the staff staircase. Lucien's hand was still on her arm. 2 of his remaining men fell in behind them. She counted instinctively, the way her father had taught her. Always count. Always know the number. And behind those 2, no one. The rest of Lucien's people were either down or separated, cut off by Rinaldi's spread across the ballroom floor. The staircase was narrow and dark and smelled like old wood and cleaning product. And now, distantly, smoke. They went up. Second floor, then a landing, then a choice. The east hall was already showing orange light beneath the door at its end, and the west hall opened onto guest rooms, and eventually the western gallery, which ended at windows overlooking the cliff. Lucien stopped on the landing. He was breathing hard, controlled, the breath of someone managing exertion rather than someone afraid of it, and in the near dark his face was composed in a way that struck her as almost pathological given the circumstances. "The gallery has a service roof access," he said. "I know. 30 feet of flat roof and then the north face. The north face has a maintenance ladder to the foundation level, yes. The foundation level exits onto the cliff path, which is navigable. In the dark, in the rain that's going to start again in approximately... Elena." "What?" "Can you do it?" She looked at him. Not a complicated look, just a direct one, an inventory. "Yes," she said. They went west. The 2 men behind them stayed close, and Elena catalogued them without looking at them directly. Both Lucien's people, both competent, one with a shoulder wound that he was managing well enough for now and would manage badly later. One who moved with the particular hyper-alertness of someone running on adrenaline and very little else. She didn't know their names. In 7 years at Bellecourt, she had learned to know faces and competencies without names, because names created a kind of weight she hadn't been able to afford. She was aware that this was something she would probably think about later, in some theoretical future in which she had the luxury of thinking about things. The West Hall was clear. 3 guest rooms, a bathroom, a linen closet that she had restocked on a bi-weekly basis for 4 years, a narrow window at the hall's end that looked out onto darkness and the sound of the ocean. The gallery door was unlocked. She'd had a key to everything in this building within 18 months of her arrival, a project of patience and petty theft and a locksmith in Providence who asked no questions. And she pushed through it into the long room of marble floors and covered furniture and paintings that someone, generations back, had decided were important enough to hang, but not important enough to look at regularly. Lucien crossed the gallery fast and went directly to the north wall and the ceiling access she'd mentioned, and she watched him navigate to it without hesitation, which meant he'd been here before. He'd been here before and he'd noted the access point and filed it the way he filed everything, precisely, without sentiment, without assuming he'd never need it. She had spent 3 years thinking he was a man who ran on instinct and privilege. She had spent 4 years revising that assessment. The access hatch opened onto the service roof, and the cold hit them immediately. Not the cold of winter exactly, but the cold of Atlantic elevation, and wind, and the absence of walls, and rain that was starting again the way she'd predicted, fine and persistent and serious. The flat roof was roughly 30 feet wide and covered in weathered membrane that was slick now and getting slicker. Lucien went first, then Elena, then the 2 men. The north face of the roof edged into darkness, and below it, she couldn't see it, but she knew it. The maintenance ladder bolted to the exterior stone, running from roofline to foundation level, 22 rungs of iron that she had found on her 6th week at Bellecourt, during an inventory of the estate's exterior systems and catalogued with the same methodical thoroughness with which she'd catalogued everything else. She'd never used it. She'd never planned to be the one using it. The man with the shoulder wound went down first, because he was the least stable and because the rain was making the roof surface actively dangerous and standing still on it was its own risk. Then the second man, Then Lucien looked at her in the dark and rain, and she looked back at him, and some compressed version of a conversation happened between them in that look. The kind of conversation that takes a long time to translate into words, but occupies no time at all in the space between two people who know each other the way they knew each other, and then she went over the edge and found the ladder and descended. The cliff path at the foundation level was wet stone and darkness, and the ocean's sound enormous below and to the west. The ladder ended 8 feet above the path, and she dropped, landed, felt the impact in her knees, and kept moving. The others came down behind her. Lucien landed last and straightened and looked back up at the building, and she followed his gaze. The east face of Bellecourt was lit orange-gold with fire now, the light visible even from this angle, and she could see it reflected in the low clouds, a warm and terrible glow above a building that had stood for 140 years and was currently being destroyed by the man who'd managed it. She thought about the files. Physical files. She had always maintained physical files in addition to the digital record. Her father's discipline, never single-source your evidence, never trust a medium you can't touch. And the physical files were in the room she occupied on the 3rd floor, east side, which was now inside the burning portion of the building. "The files," she said. Lucien looked at her. "My physical documentation. 3rd floor, east wing. It's gone." The word was simple, and she heard it and understood it, and the understanding moved through her like cold water. The digital record. "The primary server is in the estate's eastern basement. Secondary copies? One in Providence, one in a deposit box in New York. Neither of which helps us tonight. We have enough without the physical files." "For what? Who are we presenting evidence to, Lucien? Your captains are split. The council's destroyed. Falsetti is either dead or he's with Vittorio by now. The Verones. The Verones haven't committed. They're going to commit to whoever is standing when the smoke clears. Right now, that's not us." He didn't answer. She looked at his profile in the dark, the rain on his face, the glow of the fire above them. "Tell me the rest," she said. "The rest of what?" "What you didn't tell me. You told me about Rinaldi 6 weeks ago. You told me about Dobrescu 8 months ago. Tonight you told me the coup was already in motion before the Suarez meeting." She kept her voice level. The cliff path was narrow, and they were moving along it, the 2 men ahead of them, and she kept pace with Lucien and kept her voice level. "What else is there?" He was quiet for 4 steps. "There's a witness," he said. She waited. "Someone who can corroborate Vittorio's account of your father's death. Not from Vittorio's side, independent. Someone who was present at the conversation in which Vittorio gave the order." He paused. "I found this person 11 weeks ago." 11 weeks. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "I was trying to determine whether the testimony was usable, whether the person could be protected long enough to—" "Who is it?" He was quiet again. Different quality of quiet. The first silence had been organizational, a man ordering what he was about to say. This one was something else. "Lucien. His name is Caruso," he said. "Enzo Caruso. He was Vittorio's driver for 9 years, up to and including the year your father died. He left the organization in 2012, relocated. I found him in October through a contact in— Where is he now?" "That's what I'm trying to— Where is he now?" Silence. The cliff path curved, and the estate's light was less direct, and the rain came down, and the ocean below was a sound like the world breathing. "I don't know," Lucien said. She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned, and she looked at him in the near dark, with the rain between them and the fire above them, and the thing she felt in her chest was not betrayal exactly, because betrayal required that the person had promised something, and Lucien had never specifically promised her complete information at every stage. But it was something adjacent to betrayal, and she was tired and cold, and the building that had been her entire world for 7 years was burning, and she was not, in this moment, capable of managing the feeling with her usual discipline. "You have been managing me," she said. "That's not— You found a witness to my father's murder 11 weeks ago, and you said nothing. You knew about the mercenaries this afternoon, and you said nothing. You knew Rinaldi was positioned to move, and you miscalculated the scale of it and said nothing." Her voice was flat, not raised. She had her father's voice in high-pressure moments, quieter, not louder. You have been making decisions about what information I receive about my own father's death. I've been making decisions about operational security. Don't. The word came out with an edge that made one of the two men ahead of them glance back. Don't explain it in those terms. I understand operational security. I have been practicing it for 7 years without a support structure or a single person in this building who knew who I actually was. She took a breath. Cold air and smoke and rain. I'm not questioning your competence. I'm telling you that you made a choice to withhold information about my father from me, and you made that choice because you decided, for whatever reason, that I could not be trusted with it, or should not have it, or would do something with it that would interfere with your plan. And I need you to own that choice. The rain came down. Lucienne's face in the dark was doing something she couldn't completely read, which was rare. She could usually read him. You would have gone to find Caruso yourself, he said. Yes. Immediately. Yes. Without the documentation complete, without the council meeting, before we had a room full of witnesses to Vittorio's reaction to your name, yes, she said, I would have. Because he is a witness to my father's murder, and I have been in that building for 7 years, and I have never once... She stopped. Something moved through her, and she closed her mouth and breathed through her nose and managed it. I would have gone. You're right. I would have gone, and it might have destroyed the plan. It would have. So you made the call. Yes. Alone. He didn't answer. Is Caruso still alive? As of 6 days ago, yes. You need to tell me where he is. Elena, if Vittorio's people have been as thorough tonight as the last 2 hours suggest, then any thread that can be traced back to evidence against him is a target. Caruso is a thread. Whether or not Vittorio knows about him, he becomes a thread the moment Vittorio starts examining what we had. She held his gaze. Tell me where he is. Whatever he was weighing behind his eyes completed its calculation. Warwick. He runs a marine supply business under his mother's maiden name. I have the address. Then we go to Warwick. We need to regroup first. My people. Your people are either dead or compromised or making decisions right now about which side of this they want to be on. And they're making those decisions based on who's standing and who has resources and who is visibly winning. She turned and started walking again. The only thing we have right now that Vittorio doesn't is Caruso. Everything else he's burned or bought or broken tonight. We go to Warwick. He fell into step beside her. She felt him looking at the side of her face, but she kept her eyes on the path. You're angry, he said. I'm cold and I'm moving, and I'll be angry later. A beat. I'll be very angry later. I know. They walked. The cliff path curved north and descended gradually toward the base of the headland, where a gravel access road connected to the estate's delivery entrance on the landward side. If the fire hadn't reached the delivery area, and depending on how Rinaldi's team had structured the burn, it might not have. There would be vehicles. If not, the road itself connected to the main coastal route approximately a mile north. Either way, they were moving. She was in the middle of calculating the distance to Warwick in current conditions. Rain, no phone, 2 wounded or fatigued assets, no vehicle confirmed, when the man at the front of the group stopped. She almost ran into him. He was standing very still, and the quality of his stillness communicated information before she'd consciously processed what she was seeing, which was a figure on the path ahead of them, standing in the rain under a pale jacket. And for a moment the shape of it made no sense. And then it made all the sense in the world, and the sense it made was the worst sense available. Enzo Caruso was 63 years old, heavy-set, with the posture of a man who had spent decades driving and had never fully straightened out his spine. She'd never met him. She knew his face from a photograph Lucien had shown her in this moment. One photograph 3 weeks ago. No, Lucien hadn't shown her anything. She didn't have a photograph. She was constructing his face from the description she'd pulled out of Lucien 30 seconds ago, and the build of the man standing on the path, and the probability that this was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. The man was not alone. Behind him, barely visible in the rain and the dark, were 2 other figures, and one of them was holding a phone whose screen lit their face briefly, long enough for Elena to see who it was, and what she saw made something go cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Verone brothers. Or one of them. Marco Verone, the elder one, the one who'd moved toward the fireplace during the ballroom chaos, standing behind Enzo Caruso on a cliff path that no one outside Vittorio's operation should have known to find. Lucien said nothing beside her. She could hear his breathing. Marco Verone lowered the phone. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 hours," he said. His voice was conversational. The conversational quality of it was the most frightening thing about it. Vittorio was very specific about the location. Elena's weapon came up. Lucien's hand closed over her wrist. Not to stop her, to tell her to wait. She waited, and she hated waiting, and she watched Caruso's face in the near dark, and what she saw there was not the face of a man being brought to them by an ally. It was the face of a man who had been brought involuntarily and who knew exactly what it meant that he was here, and who had apparently made a peace with that knowledge that she found both devastating and completely understood and had accepted. Lucien's hand released her wrist. The rain came down between them and Marco Verone in the specific silence of a moment that has already been decided by forces upstream of this exact second, decided in a hotel room somewhere, or a phone call, or a meeting that happened while the ballroom was still burning, and what was happening here on the cliff path was just the delivery mechanism of a decision made elsewhere by people who were not present. Elena kept her weapon up. "Step away from him," she said. Marco Verone looked at her with the mild patience of someone who has already run the numbers and found them favorable. He was 41, lean, with the specific kind of face that stays unremarkable no matter what expression it carries. She had watched him in the ballroom for 2 hours and had categorized him as cautious, adaptive, the kind of man who waits to see which wall is still standing before deciding where to put his back. She'd been right about the type. She'd been wrong about the conclusion. "I'm not here to hurt him," Verone said. "Then why is he on a cliff in the rain?" "Because this is where Vittorio told us to bring him." A pause. "And because I wanted to see what you'd do when you got here." Lucien spoke for the first time since the path. "Marco, Lucien, you were in Vittorio's pocket the whole time." "No." Verone shifted his weight slightly, unhurried, a man making a correction, not a defense. "I was in a position to go either direction. That's different. I've been in that position for about 3 months, since it became clear that tonight was coming regardless of what I did." He glanced at Caruso briefly. "Vittorio wanted me to bring him to the estate. I brought him here instead." Elena processed this. "Why?" she said. "Because Vittorio wins if Caruso disappears tonight. Evidence is gone, the council's broken, your files are ash, and Lucien has no organization left to lead." Verone's eyes moved between them. "That outcome is bad for me. Vittorio is not a man I want controlling the Eastern Syndicate without opposition." "So this is self-interest," Lucien said. "Every decision I have ever made is self-interest. At least I'm not pretending otherwise." Elena looked at Caruso. He was wet and cold, and had the expression of a man who had been moved around like a piece on a board for an indeterminate amount of time, and had lost the energy to pretend he was anything else. He was looking at her with something in his face that she couldn't immediately name. Not guilt exactly, because guilt is what you feel when you've done something wrong, and Caruso's crime, if it was a crime, was witnessing something and surviving it and saying nothing for 15 years. What his face held was closer to relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and is about to put it down regardless of the consequences. She lowered her weapon 2 inches. Not all the way. 2 inches. "Enzo Caruso," she said. He looked at her. "My name is Elena De Luca." He closed his eyes. Opened them. The rain ran down his face. "I know who you are," he said. "You look like your mother." She hadn't expected that. The unexpected things, in her experience, were the ones that got through. Not the calculated attacks, not the prepared blows, but the small sideways things that arrived before the defenses were oriented in the right direction. She breathed through it. "I need your testimony," she said. "I know. Tonight, not in a week, not when it's convenient. I said I know." His voice was rough. Old smoker's voice. He looked down at the wet gravel of the path and then back up at her face. "I've been sitting on this for 15 years. You think I don't know what that makes me? I don't care what it makes you. I care what you saw. He nodded, slow. Everything, he said. I'll tell you everything. There was no time for it here. Elena understood that the cliff path was not a place to take a 15-year testimony from a man who needed warmth and time and something to settle his hands, and that every minute they remained stationary on this path was a minute in which Vittorio's people, who knew about Caruso, who had sent Marco Veroni to collect him, were either recalibrating or converging. She looked at Verone. Where's your vehicle? Road, north side, 2 of mine are with it. You're driving us. That was my intention. If at any point tonight I determine that you've made a different calculation, you'll shoot me. Yes, I understand the terms. He said it without particular concern. The manner of someone who has done business under difficult terms before and finds the terms clarifying rather than threatening. They moved. The cliff path to the road took 11 minutes in the dark and the rain, and those 11 minutes were the specific quality of time that exists between the end of one bad thing and the beginning of the next bad thing, and everyone moving through them knew it, and no one spoke. The man with the shoulder wound was slowing. Elena marked it and said nothing. Lucienne walked beside her, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, not because she was thinking about it, but because its absence would be immediately notable. Verone's vehicle was an unremarkable black SUV parked at the road's edge with its lights off. 2 men stood outside it who looked at the approaching group with the controlled alertness of people who'd been briefed on what to expect and found the reality approximately consistent with the briefing. They moved aside. 7 people into the vehicle. Tight. The shoulder-wound man's breathing had become audible. Verone drove. She didn't ask where they were going. She watched the road for a minute and determined they were heading inland, away from the coast, and that was directionally correct. Away from Bellecourt, away from the burning, away from Vittorio's primary operational territory. She let him drive. In the back seat, compressed between Lucien and the door, she turned to Caruso. "Start talking," she said. And he did. He talked for 40 minutes while the rain moved across the windshield and the road unrolled through dark Rhode Island countryside, and what he said in those 40 minutes was not a surprise. Not to her, not intellectually, because she had assembled the shape of it across 7 years of fragments and inferences and evidence that pointed consistently in one direction. But there is a difference between knowing the shape of something and hearing the specific words. There is a difference between evidence and testimony, between the architecture of a conclusion and the voice of a man who was in the room. Vittorio had given the order. Caruso had driven the car. 2 other men, both dead now, Caruso believed, had carried it out. The method, the location, the way her father had looked at the men who came for him, and what he had said, which Caruso had been told by the 2 men afterward, which was one sentence, which Caruso repeated now in a voice that was entirely flat, because he had been holding the sentence for 15 years and had worn all the feeling off of it. Elena looked out the window at the dark passing landscape. Lucienne's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat. Not a romantic gesture, not comfort exactly, just contact, the physical acknowledgement of another person's presence. She didn't pull away. They stopped at a motel 40 minutes inland that Verone apparently knew, and the man at the desk apparently knew Verone, and there were no questions. 2 rooms. Elena took Caruso into one of them with the second of Lucienne's 2 men, the one without the shoulder wound, who sat in the corner while she spent 90 minutes going through Caruso's account with the systematic thoroughness her father had taught her. Not accepting the narrative in the order it was offered, but breaking it into components and testing each one, asking for specifics that a constructed story wouldn't have, listening for the particular texture of true things, which is not the smoothness people imagine, but the roughness, the contradictions, the details that don't quite fit and are therefore real. It held. Every piece of it held. At some point, Lucienne appeared in the doorway, and she looked up at him, and he read her face and nodded once. Then his phone, retrieved from one of Verone's men, who'd had the foresight to grab Lucien's jacket from somewhere on the way out of the estate, jacket with phone inside, buzzed. He looked at it. His expression did a specific thing. "What?" she said. "Falsetti's alive." She waited. "He's reached out. He wants a meeting." Falsetti was in Vittorio's coalition until Vittorio's mercenaries put him on the floor of the ballroom and his head hit a marble step hard enough to require stitches. Lucien's voice was dry. Apparently that clarified some things for him. Where does he want to meet? He's named a location. A place in Providence, he says, is neutral. An hour from now. She looked at Caruso, who had fallen into an exhausted, upright sleep in the room's single chair. She looked at the window where the rain was still going. She thought about the specific arithmetic of their current situation. No documentation, no counsel, a burning estate, an organization in fracture, one witness who would not survive being moved through the open for long, and Vittorio somewhere in the dark making his own calculations with resources they hadn't fully mapped. She thought about Falsetti. Carmine Falsetti was 68 years old and had controlled the New Jersey waterfront for 22 years and had survived 2 assassination attempts and was not a stupid man. He was also a man who had walked into Bellecourt tonight believing he was attending a managed transition of power and had instead attended a massacre, and the difference between those two things was the kind of difference that made men reconsider fundamental alliances. It could be a setup, she said. Yes. Vittorio has his number. Vittorio has everyone's number, but Falsetti has 22 years of reasons to not want Vittorio running the Eastern Syndicate without checks. They've been in competition for New Jersey port access since 2008. Self-interest, she said, the same word she'd used with Verone. Only kind that holds. She stood up. Her legs ached. Her shoulder, where she'd impacted the cliff path during the descent, was developing a bruise she wouldn't fully feel until tomorrow. Her hair was still wet. She'd been wearing a maid's uniform for the past, she checked the time and revised her estimate, 6 hours, and the uniform was torn at the hem and stained with someone else's blood, and she was aware of what she looked like and did not particularly care. Tell him yes, she said. The location Falsetti had named was a restaurant in Providence's Federal Hill that had been closed for 2 years, but whose owner, apparently, owed Falsetti a standing favor in the form of a key. They arrived to find it dark, empty, smelling of old cooking oil and the specific closed building smell of a place that had once been full of people and wasn't anymore. Falsetti was already there, at a table near the back with 2 men flanking him and a piece of gauze taped to the left side of his head where the stitches were. He looked exactly as bad as a man should look after the evening he'd had, and the fact that he'd made it here at all, in one piece, with the wherewithal to arrange a meeting, told her something useful about him. He looked at Elena when they walked in. "You're DeLuca's girl," he said. Not unkind, just identifying. "Yes. I knew your father." He said it without sentimentality. "He was a difficult man." "He was. Sat across from him 3 times. Once he nearly had me killed." A pause. "Fair enough, given the context." He looked at Lucien. "Sit down." They sat. Falsetti had the remains of an espresso in front of him and the manner of a man conducting a business meeting, which was, she understood, how he processed extreme stress, by treating it as business. Some people collapsed inward. Some people got loud. Falsetti apparently got administrative. "Vittorio has 8 captains confirmed," he said. 3 are still uncommitted. Rinaldi is running operational coordination. The estate is a total loss. Fire department's been called, but it's too far along. Dobrescu is confirmed with Vittorio, which gives him the Philadelphia port access. He looked between them. "What do you have?" "A witness," Lucien said. Falsetti's eyes shifted. "To what?" "To the conversation in which Vittorio ordered Matteo De Luca's murder." The old man was quiet for a moment. "That witness is alive. Currently. Vittorio knows about them? He knows there's a thread. He may not know the specific thread yet." Falsetti picked up his espresso cup and looked into it and set it down, finding it empty. He seemed mildly disappointed. "The Atlantic routes," he said. "If Vittorio consolidates, if he takes the syndicate clean, those routes go through him, which means my waterfront access goes through him, which means 22 years of independent operation becomes contingent," Elena said. "Contingent." He said the word like it tasted wrong. "I am 68 years old. I did not spend 68 years in this business to become contingent." She leaned forward slightly. The 3 uncommitted captains, she said. How fast can you reach them? Tonight? Right now. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone recalibrating an estimate. 2 of them, yes. The third is complicated. The 2. What's the offer? She looked at Lucien. He looked back at her. The look was brief and contained, and what moved through it was not a question but a confirmation. Both of them arriving at the same answer from the same calculation, and the confirmation of that convergence was its own kind of steadiness. The Atlantic routes are reorganized, Lucien said. Equitable access. No single family controls the primary corridor, oversight structure with rotating authority. He paused. The captains who come in tonight are protected. The captains who chose Vittorio answer for it. And De Luca? Falchetti's eyes were on Elena. I'm not a family, she said. I don't want territory. I want the testimony heard by the right people and the record corrected. That's all. That's not nothing, she said. But no, I'm not here for the routes. Falchetti was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain had intensified again, hammering against the restaurant's shuttered windows with renewed conviction. The city outside was doing what cities do in the middle of the night, existing without concern for the specific human problems occurring within it. Vittorio moves at dawn, Falchetti said. That's what I was told before the ballroom. The consolidation phase starts at 6 a.m. He has people positioned at Lucien's primary offices in Boston and New York. He'll move to freeze the financial accounts at first banking hour, which will neutralize whatever operational capacity Lucien has left. He looked at the table. You have approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. Elena laid it out in her mind with the cold efficiency her father had spent her childhood installing. 4 hours to reach 2 uncommitted captains and bring them across, confirm Caruso's protection, build enough coalition weight to deny Vittorio his clean consolidation, and do all of it without a reliable communication network, without documentation, without a base of operations, without sleep, and without being found by the people Vittorio had in the field tonight, who were not amateurs and were not going to stop looking. 4 hours. Call the captain, Jeet, she said to Falchetti. He reached for his phone. That was when the window broke. Not one window. 3, simultaneously, the glass coming in fast and low from the street-facing side of the building, and Elena was moving before she'd registered the sound as glass, her body running on its own instructions, dropping behind the nearest table and pulling Falchetti's arm on the way down. And the 2 shots that came through the broken windows went through the space where she'd been sitting. Falchetti hit the floor hard. He was 68, and he moved like it, but he moved, and his 2 men returned fire toward the windows immediately, which told her they were professionals who didn't need a second to decide. Lucien was already behind the bar. Verone's man was down. She registered this in the peripheral, a shape on the floor near the door, not moving. 3 shooters at the windows. Maybe more outside. Vittorio had known about the meeting. Ishpam. That thought arrived with the specific weight of something that changes everything downstream of it. Vittorio had known about the meeting, which meant either Falchetti had been followed from wherever he'd been in the hours since the ballroom, or Falchetti's outreach to Lucien had been intercepted, or someone in the chain between Falchetti and this room had communicated the location to people who were now outside. She looked at Falchetti. He was on the floor, breathing hard through his nose, his face the color of old concrete. He was not shot. He was 68 years old and lying on the floor of a closed restaurant, and the evening had been very long. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds and read what was in it, and what was in it was not guilt, but it was not complete innocence either, and the specific quality of his eye contact, the way it held slightly too steady, slightly too deliberate, the way honest panic looks different from performed panic, told her something she did not want to know. Carmine, she said. Another shot came through the windows. Lucien returned fire from behind the bar. Carmine. Her voice was very quiet, very even. The evenness was not calm. Did you tell him where we were meeting? Falchetti's jaw worked. It wasn't... He stopped, started again. He already knew about the witness. He's had people looking since before the estate. I told him the location because he promised me... What did he promise you? The northern routes. Independent. No oversight. His voice had flattened. The administrative quality was gone. What was left was something older and more exhausted. I'm 68 years old, I told you. Elena looked at him for one more second. Then she looked away. Not because she was done with him. Because the windows were still broken and people were still shooting. And the conversation with Falsetti was a conversation for later, for when there was a later, and the only thing that existed right now was the next 30 seconds. Lucien came low and fast from the bar and reached her, and his face had the specific look. Not rage, something past rage, something that had compressed past its own heat into something colder, of a man who'd heard. The back, he said. They'll have the back. Kitchen exit onto the alley. It's not a good option. It's the only option. There's one more option, he said, and his voice had a quality she recognized as meaning he was about to say something she wasn't going to like. No. Elena, whatever you're about to suggest, Vittorio wants me alive. He's made that clear. If I walk out the front, absolutely not. I buy you time to get Caruso out. You get Caruso to Lucien. She grabbed his jacket, not gently. If you walk out that door, they take you. And the moment they take you, everything Vittorio needs to complete the consolidation is in one place, and he has no reason left to keep you alive. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? I understand. Then stop suggesting it. He looked at her. The shooting had paused. Reloading, repositioning, the shooters outside doing whatever shooters outside do in the 15-second gaps between active engagement. Then what? He said. Walk out through gunfire with one working asset and an old man who just sold us. She thought for exactly 2 seconds. Not us, she said. Me. He stared. Vittorio wants you alive. You said it yourself. She checked her weapon. 4 rounds. Not enough, but 4. He doesn't want me. I'm a complication he'd prefer to eliminate, which means the people outside are here for you, which means their attention is calibrated for you. She looked up at him. So you go out the back with Caruso. I go out the front. That is the exact same plan I just suggested, with the variables reversed, which makes it the opposite plan. Elena, a shot came through the window, high. A warning or a miss. They're moving, she said. We have 30 seconds before they're inside. Decide. His face did something that she did not have the 30 seconds to fully translate, and she filed it for later, for the theoretical future that required her to survive the next 10 minutes to access. And then he said her name. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. And she said, after, she said. Tell me after. She stood up. Lucien caught her arm one final time, and she turned, and he looked at her with the specific look of a man out of arguments, out of alternatives, holding on to the last seconds before something happens that he cannot stop, and he said 4 words that she carried with her through the door. Come back to me. She didn't answer. There wasn't time, and there wasn't a version of an answer that wouldn't cost something she needed to keep. She pushed through the restaurant's front door and into the rain and the street and the immediate, clarifying reality of 3 men outside who had not expected the door to open from the inside. The first second was hers. She used it. The first man was 6 feet away, and she covered that distance before he'd finished processing what he was seeing. Not a target he'd been briefed on, not Lucien Moretti, but a woman in a torn maid's uniform with blood on the hem and a weapon she already had raised. And she hit him with her shoulder instead of shooting, because 4 rounds and 3 men and a street she needed to cross required a specific economy of violence. He went sideways into a parked car. She kept moving. The second man shot. He missed. He missed because she was already angled away from where she'd been when he pulled the trigger. A movement that was not tactical calculation but body memory. Something built into her below the level of conscious decision by years of training in that compound outside Palermo, where her father had said, over and over, the person who thinks while moving is the person who dies while thinking. She fired once. The second man went down. The third man was at the corner of the building, covering the alley entrance. His attention had been on the alley, on the back, on wherever he'd been told to expect the exit attempt. And it cost him the half-second that cost him everything. She was on him before he'd fully turned, and the fight that followed was close and ugly and lasted approximately 9 seconds, and ended with her on her knees on the wet pavement with her hands shaking and the man unconscious at her feet, and the 2 remaining rounds in her weapon unfired. She breathed. She breathed for 3 full seconds, hands on her thighs, rain on her back, the street around her empty and dark and loud with weather. Then she stood up. There had been 3 outside. There were likely more somewhere, a vehicle, a secondary position, because Vittorio's operations didn't run on minimums. She moved north along the street, fast but not running, because running on a wet urban street in the middle of the night is how you attract exactly the kind of attention that ends the evening badly, and she had enough problems without adding local law enforcement to the list. Her phone was gone. Her phone had been gone since the cliff path. She had no way to reach Lucian, no way to know if the back exit had worked, no way to know if Caruso was out, no way to know anything except the 30 square feet of Providence Street immediately around her. She moved. 4 blocks north, she found a gas station open, fluorescent and clean, staffed by a teenage boy who looked at her state with an expression that started as alarm and became something more complicated when she put $40 on the counter, which was all the cash remaining in the pocket of the maid's uniform, and asked to use the phone behind the register. The boy looked at the money. He pushed the phone across the counter. She called the only number she had memorized from the last 3 months that wasn't Lucien's. The number of a woman named Carla, who ran a legal firm in Providence, and who had been, for 6 years, the attorney of record for a succession of shell companies connected to the DeLuca estate's residual assets, and who had known, since Elena's 3rd year at Bellacourt, who Elena actually was and what she was actually doing there. Carla answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she was awake, which meant she already knew something. "Tell me you're alive," Carla said. "I'm alive. I need a location. I've been watching the fire on the news for 3 hours. The estate is, I know, location. Lucien Moretti. He was going out the back of a restaurant on Federal Hill approximately 8 minutes ago with a witness named Caruso and possibly 1 asset. A pause. Keyboard sounds. There's a call came through my secondary number 20 minutes ago. A man who identified himself as a contact of yours. He left a location." She closed her eyes briefly. "Give it to me." The location was a parking structure 4 blocks from the restaurant, which was the kind of location you chose when you needed somewhere covered and anonymous, and the alternative was the street. She thanked Carla and hung up and looked at the teenage boy, who had been staring at the wall with the focused non-attention of someone deliberately not listening. She pushed another $10 across the counter. Cab company number. He wrote it on a receipt without being asked. She was at the parking structure in 11 minutes. "3rd level," Carla had said. She took the stairs and came out onto the 3rd level and found Lucien standing next to a concrete pillar with the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting and managing the experience of waiting by converting it into watchfulness. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. It was not a dramatic moment, not in the cinematic sense. There was no movement toward each other, no immediate physical relief. Just the specific quality of 2 people who had been briefly separated under conditions that made separation dangerous, and were now in the same space again, and were taking a second to let that reality settle before moving on to the next required thing. Then she said, "Caruso." "Here." He gestured to a car parked against the far wall. The interior light showed Caruso in the back seat with the second of Lucian's men from earlier, who looked worse than he had on the cliff, but was present and functional. The men outside the restaurant. 3. 2 are down. 1 is unconscious, no permanent damage. She paused. "Probably." Lucian looked at her for a moment in the specific way of someone conducting an inventory they're not going to state out loud, and then he nodded once. "Falsetti," she said. "I know." He told Vittorio the location. "I know. In exchange for the northern routes." "Yes." His voice was very flat. "He's 68 years old," she said. Not as excuse, as data point. He made a choice. He'll answer for it. A pause. Later. She understood the later. Later was a concept that required surviving the tonight, which was not yet complete, which was in fact approaching its most concentrated point rather than receding from it. Because Vittorio was still operational, still resourced, and the 4-hour window Falcetti had described before the dawn consolidation Before the financial accounts, before the organized dismantling of what remained of Lucien's organization, was now approximately 3 hours and counting. "The captains," she said. "Falsetti gave me 2 names before—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Before he made his other call. I've been on the phone. And one is in. One needs the testimony. Caruso can give it. Tonight? Right now. On the phone, if necessary." She looked at the car where Caruso sat. "He's been holding this for 15 years. He's not going to hold it another hour." They worked through the next 2 hours the way you work through the only option available when all the better options have been removed, steadily, without grace, one task at a time. Caruso spoke to the captain, a man named Seville who ran operations out of Hartford and had been in Vittorio's column until approximately 11:30 that evening, when 2 of his own men had been used by Rinaldi without his authorization, which was the specific kind of disrespect that clarified allegiances faster than any argument. Seville listened to Caruso for 14 minutes. Then Seville made 3 calls of his own. By 3 in the morning, the shape of the thing had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that makes for clean narrative, but not a tide turning, not a sudden reversal. It changed the way difficult things change when you refuse to stop moving. Incrementally, grudgingly, each small shift purchased at specific cost. By 3 a.m., they had 2 captains confirmed, Seville's additional contacts generating 2 more who were at minimum no longer active Vittorio assets, and the specific information about Dobrescu's involvement with the Atlantic routes, providing enough leverage to bring the Romanian into a neutral position through a phone call that Lucien made in a voice she had never heard from him before. Very quiet, very specific. The voice of someone reading from a document of consequences. Dobrescu went neutral. That left Rinaldi. Rinaldi was not going to go neutral. Rinaldi was past the point of neutral and had been for months, and the specific facts of his position, exposed in front of a room full of witnesses, his treachery named and documented, his 20 years of careful organizational invisibility detonated in a single evening, left him no version of the future that did not require Vittorio's complete victory. He was the one element in the equation that could not be negotiated or leveraged or flipped. He was going to have to be dealt with the other way. It was Lucien's man, the one with the shoulder wound who had, against all the odds of the shoulder wound, continued to function through the night with the particular stubbornness of someone who understood that stopping was not an option, who located Rinaldi. Through a contact, through a phone chain that took 40 minutes to resolve, through the specific underground geography of a criminal network that still, despite the night's fractures, contained more people loyal to Lucien than Vittorio had estimated. Rinaldi was at a hotel in Warwick, the same city where Caruso's marine supply business operated, which was either coincidence or it wasn't, and in Elena's experience, nothing was coincidence when it could be planning. She looked at Lucien. He was sitting against the parking structure wall with his jacket off and a cut on his forearm that she hadn't known about, which meant it had happened in the restaurant and he hadn't mentioned it because they'd had more pressing items, and which was still bleeding slowly in the way that cuts bleed when you've been moving too much to let them stop. She found a cloth in the car's first aid kit and sat down next to him and wrapped the cut with the specific efficiency of someone who has dressed wounds before and is not sentimental about it. He watched her work. "Rinaldi," she said. "Yes." "He knows where Caruso is." "If he knows we have Caruso, yes." "Does he know?" "He knows we got out of the restaurant. He knows the 3 men outside were not successful. Beyond that," he exhaled, "he'll assume we have Caruso. He's not a stupid man. Which means he's already told Vittorio. Probably." She tied off the cloth. Her fingers were cold enough that the last knot took 2 attempts. "This ends tonight," she said. "Yes. Vittorio and Rinaldi both, tonight, before 6. He looked at the cloth on his arm. "That's 2 hours." "I know. With what we have." "With what we have." He was quiet. She could hear him thinking. Not literally, but the particular quality of his silence when he was running scenarios, the slight change in his breathing, the stillness of a man whose mind was extremely busy. "The cathedral," he said. She looked at him. "Underneath the estate. Old stone foundation. It was built as storage, then used during Prohibition, then renovated into what my grandfather called a private meeting room, which is what powerful men call places they want to have important conversations without witnesses. His voice was even. It's accessible from the cliff path, from the original exterior entrance. The fire wouldn't have reached the foundation level. Vittorio knows about it. And it's where Vittorio goes when he needs to consolidate privately, when he needs to be somewhere he controls completely. He looked at her. He'll be there. He's been building toward this night for 3 years. He's not going to spend it in a hotel room. He's going to spend it in the place that was always supposed to be his. She thought about the cliff path, the rain, the 22 rungs of iron ladder in the dark. She thought about going back. "You've been in that building for 7 years," Lucien said. "You know every entrance. There's a second exterior access to the foundation level, east face. It's not on any architectural plan. My grandfather had it built during a renovation in 1987. It's behind a false section of cliff face, accessed from a ledge about 40 feet above the waterline." He paused. "I found it when I was 11. I've never told anyone." She looked at him. "You've been holding that for tonight." "I've been holding that for the night I needed it." A beat. "That's tonight." She was quiet for a moment. "Rinaldi will be with him." "Probably." "What do we have?" He took stock. 2 operational assets, one of whom was declining, 1 recovered weapon from the restaurant with 2 rounds, Verone's man who was unreachable since the restaurant and whose allegiance was in any case provisional, and 2 of them. "It's not enough," she said. "No." "But we're going anyway." "Yes." She stood up and held out her hand, and he took it, and she pulled him to his feet, and there was nothing romantic in the mechanics of it. She was tired, and he was bleeding, and the night was cold, and they both knew exactly where they were going and exactly what waited there. But she held his hand for a second after he was standing, and he held hers, and they stood in the parking structure at 3:40 in the morning with the rain audible on the roof several stories above them. Then they went. They left Caruso with the shoulder-wound man and the car, and a phone with Carla's number and instructions that were simple. "If we are not back in 90 minutes, you call that number and you tell her everything you told us, and you do not move from this location for any reason, for any person, regardless of who asks." Caruso looked at Elena. "Your father," he said. It was the last thing he said before she walked away from the car, and she stopped but didn't turn around. "He told me once, before everything. He said the thing about this life is that it asks you to be a smaller person than you are. Every compromise, every silence, everything you don't say." A pause. "He said he hoped his daughters would find a way to be bigger." She stood with her back to him for one breath. "He was an optimist," she said. Then she walked. The cliff path in the rain at 4 in the morning was a different thing than it had been earlier. The rain had peaked and was now simply persistent, no longer dramatic, just present and cold and indifferent. The path was mud in sections, firm stone in others, and they moved through it in near silence, conserving the breath and the attention for what was coming. The ledge was where Lucien said it was, 40 feet above the Atlantic, accessible from a section of the path where a narrow traverse cut horizontally across the cliff face, invisible from above and from the water, visible only if you knew where to put your feet. She went first because she trusted her footing on wet rock more than she trusted anyone else's, and Lucien came behind her, and they crossed it in the dark with the ocean very large and very close below them. The false section of cliff face was a hinged panel of stone and composite material, old enough to have weathered into invisibility, and the mechanism was corroded but functional, and it opened onto a stone passage that smelled like salt and age and the specific underground cold of a space that never saw sun. They went in. The passage ran for approximately 40 feet before opening into the foundation level, the space Lucien had called the cathedral, and which she could see now deserved the name not for any formal reason, but for the way the stone vaulted above them, and the candlelight, which was present and burning, moved the shadows in ways that made the space feel larger than it was and older than it was, and more final. Vittorio was there. He was seated at a long table that occupied the room's center, with 2 candles lit in front of him and a glass of something amber-colored at his right hand, and he looked for all the world like a man sitting in his own home, which, she supposed, he believed he was. Rinaldi stood at the room's far end, and one other man, whom she didn't recognize, positioned near the original interior stairs that led up into what had been the estate's lower level before the fire. Vittorio looked at them when they entered. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't stand. He looked at them with the specific expression of a man encountering something that is not a surprise, but is perhaps a slight miscalculation of timing. "You found the East Passage," he said to Lucien. "You always knew I knew about it." "I knew you knew about it at 11. I thought you'd forgotten." He picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. "Apparently not." The room held. Rinaldi's hand was at his side, close to where a weapon would be. The third man hadn't moved. Elena calculated the distance between herself and Rinaldi. 30 feet, 2 rounds. The third man was closer to Lucien's side and was the more immediate problem if he moved first. "It's finished, Vittorio," Lucien said. "Is it?" 2 captains committed tonight. Seville, Moretti. Dobrescu is neutral. The council testimony from Caruso goes to 3 independent contacts in the next 2 hours, regardless of what happens in this room. The financial account access you were planning to freeze at 6 a.m. has been restructured. I made that call an hour ago. There's nothing left to consolidate. Vittorio listened to all of this with the patience of a man who has been listening to complicated information for 60 years. He turned his glass once on the table. "And Falchetti?" he said. "Falchetti chose badly. Falchetti is 68 years old and wanted to die having made one final smart decision." A pause. "Can't blame him for that." "You can," Elena said. "Pretty easily." Vittorio's eyes moved to her. They stayed there. "You came here to kill me," he said. "I came here to finish this." "That's the same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't." She kept her voice even. Her weapon was at her side. Her hand was not trembling, and she was aware of this in the way you become aware of things you're not sure you could have guaranteed. "Killing you was the plan I came to Bellecourt with, 7 years ago. I was 24 years old and my father was dead, and the shape of the world was very simple. And now the shape of the world is not simple." She looked at him steadily. "What I want is for you to account for it. What you did. In front of the people it needs to be said in front of." Vittorio was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to do that," he said. "I know. So we're back to the same thing." "We were always going to end up here," she said. "I just needed to know whether there was another way first." Rinaldi moved. He moved fast and professional, clearing his weapon and bringing it up in one motion. And Elena was already turning, the 30 feet collapsing faster than it should have been possible to collapse them. And she fired once, and the round went exactly where she'd been trained to put it, and Rinaldi went down and hit the stone floor of the old foundation room and did not move. 1 round left. The third man had moved on Lucien. What happened between them in the next 15 seconds was not clean. It was the opposite of clean. 2 men fighting in a space that wasn't built for it, catching each other on stone and furniture, and the specific ugly mechanics of close-quarters violence, where technique matters less than desperation and willingness to absorb punishment in order to deliver it. Lucien was bleeding again before it ended. The third man was not moving when it did. Vittorio had stood at some point during this. He was standing now at the end of the long table, and his weapon was in his hand but not raised, and Elena was across the table from him with 1 round left, and the specific, terrible clarity of a moment that has been approaching for 7 years and has finally arrived. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You look like your mother," he said. The same thing Caruso had said. It landed differently from Vittorio's mouth. It landed like an acknowledgement of something he had chosen to ignore and was now, at the end of everything, no longer able to. "You knew her," Elena said. "I knew your whole family, before." He set the weapon on the table. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was something more complicated than surrender. The gesture of a man who has decided that the mechanics of the ending are less important than the ending itself, and who is perhaps tired. "Your father and I worked together for 6 years before the money became what it became, before the choices became what they became. You killed him." "Yes." "Say it." He met her eyes. "I ordered Matteo De Luca's death," he said, "in the spring 15 years ago, to prevent him from exposing financial activity I had conducted without the organization's knowledge. I framed the Calabrese faction. I allowed a war to occur that I could have stopped. He said it with the steadiness of a man giving a formal statement, each word placed deliberately, and she understood that this was his own form of accounting. Not remorse, because she didn't think Vittorio Moretti's architecture included remorse in the structural sense, but recognition. The acknowledgement that a thing occurred and that he was the origin of it. "There's a witness," she said. "To the order. He'll confirm everything you just said." I assumed. Lucien was behind her now. She could feel him there without turning. The candles on the table moved. The foundation room breathed around them with old stone and old cold and the distant eternal sound of the Atlantic working on the cliff below. "What happens now?" Vittorio said. "You come up from this room," Elena said. "You confirm to the people who need to hear it what you just told me. The testimony stands independently, with or without your confirmation, but your confirmation ends it cleanly. And then the organization makes whatever decisions the organization makes about a man who embezzled from his own family and started a war and killed an innocent man to cover it." She held his gaze. "That's not mine to decide. You could have just killed me." "Yes. Your father would have." "My father did a lot of things I've spent 7 years learning not to replicate." She paused. "He was a great man and a flawed man, and he deserved better than what you gave him. And killing you in a basement doesn't give him anything. It just gives me something. And I've been in this building for 7 years, and what I've learned is that the things that just give me something are usually the wrong things." Vittorio was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked around the end of the table, slowly, and stopped in front of her, and looked at her face with the specific attention of a man saying goodbye to something, though she couldn't have said what. "Your father," he said, "would have been proud of you, I think." He said it like a man who finds the fact inconvenient, but is no longer able to pretend otherwise. She said nothing. He walked toward the interior stairs, and Lucien moved aside to let him pass, and he climbed them into whatever remained of the estate above. Elena stood in the foundation room for a moment. The candles burned. The stone held the cold the way stone does, indifferently, without memory, with the patience of something that existed before the people who built around it, and would exist long after. The Atlantic moved below them. The rain, she realized, had stopped. Lucien stood next to her. His arm was against hers. Not much, just the side of his forearm, light and present. "We should go up," he said. "Yes." "Caruso needs to—" "I know." Neither of them moved for another 15 seconds. She was aware of what she felt, standing in the foundation room of a burning estate on the Atlantic coast with the man she'd come here to kill, and had instead, over 7 years and against every plan she'd ever made, built something with that she didn't have a clean word for. Not love in the simple sense, not partnership in the clean sense, something that had grown in the specific hostile conditions of shared danger and mutual deception and the slow grinding process of two people who had each spent years becoming very good at being alone, gradually deciding, against all the logic of their respective histories, that they didn't want to be anymore. She thought about her father, about the thing he'd said, which Caruso had passed along like a package held 15 years. "I hope my daughters find a way to be bigger." She thought she understood now what he'd meant. Not bigger than the world, not bigger than the violence and the consequence and the specific weight of the life they'd both been born into. Bigger than the smallest version of themselves. The version that reduced everything to transaction, to accounting, to the clean economy of exchange. She turned and looked at Lucien. He looked back. "After," she said, the word they'd been using all night as a promissory note for every conversation that the night had been too urgent to allow. "We're in the after." "We are," he said. "So tell me," she said. "The 4 words. The thing you said before I went out the door." He looked at her face in the candlelight of the old stone room. He said it again, quietly, in the specific voice of someone who has been carrying something and is now, without drama, setting it down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." The smallest word available for the largest thing, and the only one that fit. They climbed the stairs together and came up through the estate's lower level, through smoke-stained corridors and the smell of char and the sound of water from the firefighters who had arrived at some point in the last 2 hours and were doing what they could for what remained. They came out into the pale beginning of the Rhode Island dawn, gray and cold and utterly indifferent to what the night had been. And Vittorio was there. And 2 of Lucien's people who had found their way through the dark. And a phone call to Carla which confirmed Caruso intact and ready, and the slow, enormous machinery of consequence beginning to turn. The sun did not come up dramatically. It came up the way Rhode Island mornings come up in November, gradually, reluctantly, with the particular gray grace of a coast that has seen too much weather to bother with spectacle. Elena stood at the edge of what had been the estate's rear terrace, looking out over the Atlantic. The water was dark and enormous, and completely unbothered. Lucien stood beside her. They stood there for a while without speaking, which they had become good at in the specific way you become good at something by doing it in the hardest possible conditions. Not silence between people who have nothing to say, but silence between people who have said the important things and are now just being present in the same space while the world continues. Below the cliff, the Atlantic moved. Above them, the sky got lighter. Behind them, the work continued. The calls, the confirmations, the slow assembly of what came next from the rubble of what had just ended. It would take months. It would cost things that couldn't be calculated yet. It would require a patience that neither of them had in abundance, but both of them had in enough. She thought about 7 years, the weight of them, the specific texture of that much time spent in a place you can't fully inhabit, being a person you can't fully be, working toward an end that kept revising itself as the evidence revised itself. 7 years was a long time to be invisible. It was also, she understood now, a long time to become yourself in the negative space, to understand by being forced to set it aside exactly what you were when you weren't performing. She knew exactly what she was. She knew exactly what she wanted. She was tired. She was cold. Her shoulder ached and she was still wearing the torn maid's uniform, and somewhere in the last 8 hours she'd lost the ability to feel the tips of 3 fingers on her right hand, which she was choosing not to think about until there was a medical professional available. She was also, underneath all of that, and despite everything, and without apology, still here. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Lucien turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. And the morning came in off the Atlantic with the particular cold grace of things that have no idea they're being significant, and somewhere below them the water moved against the rocks in the oldest rhythm available. And Elena De Luca, who had come to this place to destroy something and had instead built something she hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted and wouldn't trade, looked at the man beside her and breathed and let the morning come. The empire was behind them. The reckoning was ahead of them. Between those 2 things, for exactly this moment, there was nothing but the water and the light and the specific hard-won quiet of 2 people who had survived the same night and come out the other side into whatever this was. It wasn't peace. It was something more honest than peace. It was the morning after, and it was theirs, and it was enough.